The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is now in session. It is October 30th, 2025, and tomorrow it's going to be Halloween in the United States, so a lot of trick-or-treaters are going to be coming down to my neighborhood, getting candy, and you'll have, of course, some teenagers maybe pulling off some silly April Fool's-esque pranks. I mean, that's how we do it here in the United States. It's all in good fun. But anyway, let's get on to the main topic, and that is Ukraine. A lot of interesting stuff has happened in the last 3 days, and if anything, it's a further escalation. And to discuss that escalation, let's first start off with the Zaporizhzhia direction. The armed forces of Ukraine have so far been able to push the Russians back in the town of Stepnogorsk and have seized complete control over the southern areas, including the commie blocks here. In addition, they have also been able to defend Primorsky's southern neighborhood so far from the Russians. And that's pretty much it for this front. Not much to say. Ukrainians are putting up a very tough fight there, but I don't know how long that's going to last, considering the news that is coming in from the Galeapol front. So, what do we got here? A lot of bad news for the Ukrainians. The Russians have cleared the pocket that was east of the Yanchur River. Everything here, all these fields and all these series of villages here are now all under complete Russian control. And as far as I know, the Russians have not only crossed the river, but they seem to be taking a good amount of these villages with little to no resistance. Rybne, which is in a gray zone here, according to Syriac, or contested that is about to come under Russian control. And it probably will be confirmed as such maybe tomorrow or the next day after that on November 1st. But it's definitely falling. And also, we got some breaking news coming from the Dnipropetrovsk direction, or Dnipropetrovsk region, that is. The Russians have seized complete control over the village of Vishnuovo. Sorry if I almost mispronounced it, but it's Vishnive, or Vishnovo, that is. It came under Russian control last night, and the capture of this village is a huge disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine. There were reports from the front that the Ukrainians were going to try to use this place as a defensive area, like a barrier against further Russian advances by the Vostok group. Not just deeper into the Dnipropetrovsk region, but also into the Zaporizhzhia region as well. But it seems now that this defensive area has collapsed. It basically got steamrolled by Vostok, and now they are on the brink of cutting off the road between the town of Galeapol, right here, and the town of Pokrovsky. With this road cut off, the Russians now effectively have Galeapol besieged from 3 sides, from north, east, and south. The only place where Galeapol can still get supplies is from the west. And this western road goes towards, not just towards Orkiv, but also from the regional capital Zaporizhzhia, or Zaporizhzhia, as they say in Russian. So Galeapol is basically about to be encircled on 3 sides, and if you asked for my opinion, folks, I don't really know if the armed forces of Ukraine are going to really put up a tough fight for this town. Why? Because logistically, doing so is going to be a nightmare for the armed forces of Ukraine. If they literally only have one direct road of supplies, from Galeapol to Orkiv and perhaps Zaporizhzhia city, this is going to cause a lot of nightmares for the AFU. And the drones from the Vostok group are just going to rain down on these western roads, that is, which in turn will only make the situation worse for them. So I'm not going to be surprised if the AFU does not put up a long fight here. And if anything, what I'm expecting to happen is, like, when they reach it, I think the battle is only going to last maybe 1 or 2 months, sort of like what Karakove was. Karakove, as all of you remember, fell last winter in 2024, though some would dispute and say it fell in January 2025, but it doesn't matter. It fell in winter, that is. And what happened was the Russians logistically had the advantages. They cut off the south, they cut off the east, and they cut off the north. And the only way to supply Karakove was from the west. But as we know, it wasn't enough. And the Russians still took the city regardless. And for these reasons, along also with manpower issues, because the Vostok Group, by the way, outnumbers the armed forces of Ukraine in this area, along with also having a superior, batch of soldiers on their end, I don't think Guleyapol is going to hold for that much longer. I wouldn't be surprised if by right before maybe 2025 comes to a close, so we're talking about maybe Christmas to right before New Year, like 2026, I wouldn't be surprised if Guleyapol falls to Russian control. So you're talking about like hundreds and hundreds of more square kilometers of Ukrainian territory coming under Russian control this winter. Disaster. Just absolute disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine, especially when it's a key area like Guleyapol here. Because once Guleyapol falls, then Russia is pretty much just going to roll its way into Orkhiv. And then the Ukrainians will have to evacuate Orkhiv. And then they'll have to evacuate for Zaporizhzhia city. And probably by next fall or so, the Russians might be in Zaporizhzhia city itself. But it's a little too early to tell. So anyway, I digress. Let's move on. So with things going bad for the Russians in the Zaporizhzhia region, let's also talk about their ongoing issues in the Dnipropetrovsk region as well. So, as you guys know, this is the main area for the Russians in Dnipropetrovsk region, which is arguably the Guleyapol direction, that is. But, however, we got some news coming in from the Novopavlovka front, and it's big. So, the Russians have continued their offensive in the direction of Novopavlovka and have achieved success. The Russians have finally entered the village of Novopavlovka itself and have taken control over the first 2 blocks of the town, or village. If the Russians are able to consolidate their control within Novopavlovka, there is no doubt in my mind that this area is going to fall quite quickly, and it might fall sometime during November. Novopavlovka, though quite sizable for a village, is not exactly that big. And because this is also like flat areas like here, like flat like lands and little to no terrain issues, I honestly don't know what's going to stop the Russians from wanting to seize Novopavlovka. And of course, after Novopavlovka falls to Russia, Mazova is next. But I honestly don't think they're going to do anything in the Dnipropetrovsk region, at least in this area, until after the fall of the city of Pokrovsk. And speaking of which, let's talk about the city of Pokrovsk. A lot of things have been ongoing in this direction. A lot. So, Syriac, as all of you know, took a big gamble and has put the villages of Zadishok and Suketsky under Ukrainian control. And now he also has put Dorogine under Ukrainian control too. So most of this area here, like the Doropila direction, has mostly shrunken down for the Russians, and it appears that the Ukrainians might be on the cusp of defeating the salient. But there's only one problem. It's too little too late. The Russians are about to seize complete control over the city of Pokrovsk and are about to encircle the armed forces of Ukraine within the city of Myanograd, also known as Dmitriov. within the city of Pokrovsk itself, I don't know what honestly I can say. Complete catastrophe for the armed forces of Ukraine. There is literally now no way out for the AFU troopers in Myanograd. They are completely stuck there. They will have to either surrender, attempt a breakout, which could result in high casualties in both vehicles and manpower, or they just die fighting. So, anyway, let's try to break down what's going on here, right? So, apparently, a geolocation was just recently posted onto Telegram by pro-Russian sources that state that the Russians have now seized complete control over this industrial zone here within the city of Pokrovsk. And they went so far west that they were able to plant a flag, like the Russian Federation's flag, on the sign, like the entry sign into the city of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians, of course, didn't like that, and they blew it up. It's on Deep State's Telegram if you want to see it, but I'm sure it's all over Twitter now. And also in response, the Russians then blew up the Ukrainian colors on the Pokrovsk entry sign. So there was a bit of a flag war there, and I think the Russians won 2-1. But that doesn't matter. So anyway, the Russians have seized complete control over the industrial zone here, and in the northern part of the city, they are now advancing here. They got two groups of Russians advancing in the west and in the east. The guys in the east are not very far from this road here, which has apparently been cut off by the Russians. And they are also now in complete fire control over these commie blocks here, which is in northeast Pokrovsk. Once the Russians are able to seize control over this area here, the Battle of Pokrovsk is effectively over. It is done. The Ukrainians have lost the battle for the city, pretty much for the most part, that is. And the only thing that now remains to be seen is how many losses did the AFU take in the city. But also, like, how many losses did they also take when trying to leave it? And in addition, there were also reported advances within the city of Myanograd here from the far east and a bit from the north, but that's about it. I honestly think that Myanograd is going to fall mostly without a fight once all is said and done. I honestly don't think the battle for it is going to be too long. If anything, the main battle for this whole area was the city of Pokrovsk or Krasnaya Amisk. But other than that, I don't see a big battle occurring from Myanograd and for these villages like Lisovka, Suki-Yar, and Svidle and Ravine. I just don't see it happening. Now, moving to the Konstantinovka direction. The Russians have not only broken into the city, but now there is some credible evidence to suggest that the Russians have taken more of the low-rise eastern neighborhoods in Konstantinovka. Syriac, though, still has a big chunk of it under a gray zone, but at this point, I'm very convinced that the Russians do have control over a good amount of these blocks here within the neighborhood. And because of that, I genuinely don't know if the armed forces of Ukraine will be able to keep fighting like this forever. Though I am expecting this battle in Konstantinovka to be a little slower compared to the others because of the fact that the Russians are not even close to the big commie blocks yet here, which is in these areas. And also, I think here, and I'm trying to see if there's more also here. And but yeah, they're not really close yet to delivering the final punch to the AFU. And also, Anatoly Radov has finally confirmed that Pridichine is under Russian control, and I guess this Ukrainian pocket here is pretty much been wiped out. So, yeah, the AFU is crumbling too in Konstantinovka direction. Not just Pokrovsk, not just Gulea Pol direction, but also Konstantinovka direction. And in another direction where the AFU is getting its butt whooped is the Siversk direction. Outside of the town of Siversk, Zvonovka is now being contested, with the southern part of the village now being under Russian control. And then the Russians took this small water area here, which is just south of Siversk itself. And I think now the Russians themselves, like the troops, should now be able to see not only the town of Siversk, but they should also be now able to enter it. Like the gates are now open for Siversk. Now, whether or not if they're going to be able to take this place quickly really depends on one thing. And that, my friends, is the city of Liman. Now, for those of you that remember, 3 years ago, Liman was once under Russian control. And after the fall of the twin cities of Severodonetsk and the Lysychansk, a lot of Russia fanboys thought the Russians were just going to keep steamrolling all the way to the town of Siversk and take it, like, easily without much of a fight. But the Ukrainians managed to stop the Russian advances here, and it was that way for the last 3 years. But now, that's not the case anymore. The Ukrainians have now lost complete initiative on this front, and there's reports circulating, like credible reports it is, that the majority of Yampol, like around 85 to like 90% of it, is now back under Russian control for the first time in 3 years. And once Yampol falls, then this road between Liman and Siversk will not only be cut, but it basically seals the fate of both towns. They're both going to fall to the Russians. Liman has also been breached into, speaking of which. The Russians have apparently now taken these eastern neighborhoods here within the city of Liman. And if the Russians are able to consolidate their positions, especially in the commie blocks here, in this area, then the battle is already over before it even started. But yeah, I think Liman's probably going to fall before the end of 2025 as well. I think Liman and Siversk are going to fall before New Year's. And once that happens, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, they're not going to be looking too good next year. I do think the Russians are going to keep Sloviansk and Kramatorsk on standby until they're able to deal with certain parts of the Kharkiv region. And speaking of which, let's talk about that. We got some really devastating news for the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kharkiv region, or the Kupiansk direction, that is. They are pretty cooked. A recent advance was recorded, and apparently the Russians have now seized control over the commie blocks here in southern Kupiansk, along with the village of Sadove. Though Syriac, still has a good chunk of it in a gray zone, so we're going to have to wait at least a few days or so just to get a better understanding of what's going on there. But as far as I know, the capture seems to be legitimate, and if anything, it now seems that the Russians have now fire control over Kupiansk-Vuzlove, which is the adjacent town to Kupiansk proper. And as far as I know, it seems like the Ukrainians are trying now to withdraw from this area, and if the reports are true, then this entire pocket here is going to collapse without almost a fight. Though I am expecting some fights here and there before the end of 2025 itself. So Kupiansk-Vuzlove is probably going to fall, as I said, without a fight. Maybe there'll be a few skirmishes here and there, but there won't be really that much of a fight. So the Russians have also increased their pressure on the small pocket of AFU troops here, and they seize control over this bridge as well, which connects to the city center of Kupiansk. And there's now also credible reports circulating too that the Russians have seized additional control over northeastern Kupiansk as well. So, this battle is looking pretty much done, though I don't think Kupiansk is going to fall until maybe mid to late November of 2025. And at worst, December 2025, that is, for the Russians. Russians have also recaptured the village of Fiholivka, and have also advanced a little bit eastern towards the village of Kotny and Ambarne as well. And before I get going, this will be the last thing that I will talk about before I end the video. In the Sumy direction, the armed forces of Ukraine are continuing to basically give the Russians a hard time in this area. The Russians are about to lose control over the village of Konstantinovka here. And to be quite honest with you guys, I'm not very surprised by this news, because it honestly doesn't really appear the Russians care too much about the Sumy direction anymore. I feel like they lowered it down their priority list. And I feel like they're going to recapture the village of Konstantinovka and will try to keep pushing the Russians out of the Sumy direction in the coming months. But it's not going to be easy for them. I think they're probably going to take maybe like 4 or 5 months or so before they kick the Russians out of Sumy again. But something does tell me that the Russians will try again, like do another push. But I don't know. I do think they might get kicked out again, but by then, though, it'll be too little too late. And then the next time, the Russians will really do an aggressive push into Sumy, and this time they would be successful. And of course, with the successes brewing for the Russians in Kharkov, Donetsk, and the Dnipropetrovsk directions, I honestly don't know if the Russians care that much about Sumy, because Sumy, if anything, seemed more as a distraction for the armed forces of Ukraine rather than something that was really vital. And also with the reports of a new army group coming, I wouldn't be surprised if North Group, as I said, gets redeployed to, or gets completely deployed to Sumy and Chernigov and Sumy full time, while this new army group would then take North Group's place in the Kharkov region itself. But time will tell what will happen. And until then, that's going to do it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you all found it entertaining, informative, interesting, to say the least. And I hope every single one of you has a great Halloween. So take care, everybody, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.